explore music a bit more. I wanted to bring in more elements of music, folk, classical music even, and even elements of ethnic music.
Steve Winwood was still just a teenager when he started playing at nightclubs, only 15 years old, but his voice sounded like it belonged to someone decades older. He sat at the Hammond organ with such natural confidence that it seemed like he was born to play it. People couldn't believe that someone so young could produce such a mature, soulful sound. It wasn't an act or pretense. Winwood had immersed himself in every record he could get his hands on, absorbing blues, soul, jazz, and rock music until these styles became part of who he was. While many other young British musicians were simply copying American sounds, Winwood was doing something different. He was translating those influences and making them uniquely his own. His voice carried an emotional weight that went far beyond his years, and his keyboard playing blended elements of church music, blues, and jazz into something that nobody else could replicate. Throughout his career, from his early days with the Spencer Davis Group, through Traffic and Blind Faith, to his extensive solo work, he never stopped exploring and searching for new musical territory. Winwood's favorite albums weren't just records he enjoyed listening to. They were foundational works that taught him essential lessons about music, about feeling, and about how to make an instrument truly sing or help a song breathe naturally. These 7 records demonstrated to him that technical mastery and deep emotion didn't have to conflict with each other. Instead, they could work together beautifully, and when they did, something magical happened. The first album that profoundly shaped Winwood's musical vision was Ray Charles's album from 1959. When Winwood heard Ray Charles, he discovered his true calling in music. This record did something that seemed impossible at the time, by mixing jazz, blues, pop, and gospel into one unified artistic statement powered by Ray's incredible voice. Ray's piano playing created entire worlds of sound, and his voice could break your heart or lift your spirits, sometimes within the same musical phrase. As a young boy in Birmingham, England, Winwood listened to this album and immediately knew this was the path he wanted to follow. He didn't want to simply copy Ray Charles, but rather to understand what Ray understood at a fundamental level, that music had no real borders, only feeling and emotion. Ray Charles moved effortlessly between upbeat blues numbers and tender ballads with complete command, never breaking his stride. His arrangements were sophisticated and lush, often featuring strings, but his soul always remained raw and honest. Winwood carefully studied this balance, learning how to be both sophisticated and earthy at the same time, how to honor craftsmanship without losing the soulful core of the music. What really fascinated Winwood was his keyboard technique, particularly the way his left hand walked bass lines while his right hand created melodies, and the way he made the piano talk, cry, shout, and whisper. Winwood spent years learning this musical language, and later, when his own Hammond organ playing filled concert halls with sound, Ray Charles's lessons were evident in every note. Ray was teaching him how to make keys breathe like living things, and how to make chord progressions tell complete stories. The second major influence came from Muddy Waters. While Winwood had discovered electric blues through Muddy's earlier work, the 1964 album showed him something entirely different. This record featured Muddy unplugged, sitting down with just an acoustic guitar and playing. There was no electricity, no amplification, just pure Delta blues stripped down to its absolute essence. Muddy's voice rumbled like distant thunder approaching, and his guitar playing was sparse yet perfect, with every note landing exactly where it needed to be. When Winwood heard this album, he learned a crucial lesson, that power didn't necessarily need volume, and that sometimes quiet moments could hit harder than loud ones. Muddy Waters had essentially invented electric Chicago blues and was the man who made the blues shout with amplification. So when he returned to acoustic twang, people listened even more closely. The song sounded both ancient and timeless. Muddy proved he didn't need any effects to create powerful feelings, because his presence itself was the effect. Winwood absorbed this lesson deeply. Later, when he played with the Spencer Davis Group, this understanding lived in every note he played. What particularly hooked Winwood was Muddy's complete authenticity. This wasn't someone merely playing blues music as a genre exercise. This was a man who lived the blues, who carried it in his bones and his life experience. That kind of realness couldn't be faked or manufactured. You either had it or you didn't, and Muddy had it. He showed young Winwood that technical skill meant nothing without truth behind it, that all the musical ability in the world was worthless if the heart wasn't genuinely in it. The third transformative album for Winwood was Miles Davis's masterpiece from 1959. When Steve Winwood heard this record, time seemed to stop. Miles Davis released this groundbreaking work that fundamentally changed what music could be. It introduced modal jazz, where improvisation was built on feeling and mood instead of traditional chord changes. Miles's trumpet spoke in whispers that somehow cut deeper than any scream could ever. John Coltrane's saxophone on this album searched for something that seemed just beyond reach, creating an atmosphere of yearning and exploration. The entire album floated like smoke, beautiful and impossible to grasp completely. Winwood was young when he first heard it, but he understood that this represented true freedom in music. These were musicians talking to each other in a language that only they fully understood. The opening track began with bass and piano having an intimate conversation, and then Miles entered with a melody so simple it was almost painful in its beauty. Every musician on the album played with total restraint. Nothing was wasted, nothing was rushed. The spaces between notes mattered just as much as the notes themselves. Winwood studied this approach carefully, learning how silence was an integral part of the music, how waiting and restraint made the eventual resolution even sweeter. What changed Winwood forever was observing the improvisation on this record. These musicians weren't following any predetermined script. They were creating in real time, responding to each other moment by moment, building something together that would never exist in exactly the same way again. This spontaneity became absolutely central to Winwood's own musical approach. Traffic's extended jam sessions and his own keyboard solos that went wherever the feeling led them all traced their roots back to this album. Miles Davis taught Steve Winwood that jazz and rock could be part of the same family, that improvisation was essentially a conversation between musicians, and that the spaces between sounds were just as important as the sounds themselves. The fourth crucial album came from Booker T. Jones and was released in 1962. Steve Winwood found his organ sound through this record. That Hammond B3 organ sound fundamentally changed rock and roll music. Booker T played with the perfect mixture of power and restraint. The title track was simply a groove, straightforward and unstoppable. The organ bubbled and churned while the guitar answered back, and the rhythm section locked in tight for several minutes of pure soul that never became tiresome or repetitive. When Winwood heard this, he immediately knew what he wanted to accomplish in his own music: make the organ the lead instrument and make it sing like a human voice. Booker T and his band were the house band for a famous record label, backing numerous legendary soul singers. But on this album, they stepped into the spotlight themselves. It was Booker T's organ that truly dominated the sound with its thick, warm, soulful tone. Winwood studied every single note, learning how Booker used the instrument's drawbars, how he created that distinctive growl, and how he made the organ sound funky and alive.
What Winwood particularly loved was the economy of the playing. Nothing was overcomplicated. These were simply great musicians playing together and serving the groove. There were no solos performed just for the sake of showing off technical ability. Everything served the song itself. This discipline became a core part of Winwood's own musical approach. Later, when he played with Spencer Davis, Booker T's influence exploded from every note. Booker T and his band taught Steve Winwood that soul was fundamentally a feeling rather than something tied to race or background, that groove was sacred and had to be respected, and that the organ could be funky, soulful, and powerful all at the same time. The fifth album that expanded Winwood's musical consciousness was released in 1966. Steve Winwood heard this record and his entire understanding of what was possible in music expanded dramatically. This was a group at their most experimental and fearless. They used the recording studio itself as an instrument, employing backwards guitars, tape loops, and string arrangements that sounded like nightmares or dreams. One track in particular was rock music that seemed to come from another planet entirely. Another song broke hearts with just strings and voices working together. This album showed Winwood that pop music could genuinely be art, that musicians could experiment wildly and still connect with audiences and still matter culturally. Every song in the album pushed in a new direction. The musicians weren't just making records in a traditional sense. They were exploring what records could potentially be. Winwood was doing something similar with Traffic around the same time period, mixing rock with jazz, folk, and psychedelic elements. This album gave him permission and showed him that others were also pushing boundaries. What amazed Winwood most was the fearlessness on display. These musicians had already achieved everything: fame, money, screaming fans around the world. They could have kept making simple pop songs forever and maintained their success. Instead, they risked everything while chasing something deeper and more real. That courage inspired Winwood profoundly. When he left the Spencer Davis Group at the peak of their commercial success to form Traffic, this album was part of his motivation. Sometimes you had to walk away from safety and comfort to discover something genuinely real and meaningful. This record taught Steve Winwood that musical evolution wasn't a betrayal of your past, that growth was absolutely necessary, and that the recording studio was an instrument waiting to be played creatively. The sixth album that shaped Winwood's musical soul was released in 1965. Steve Winwood described this record as a spiritual experience. The artist released this 4-part suite, and it was essentially prayer transformed into music. The saxophone playing reached toward the divine, searching for God, finding God, thanking God. The entire album was worshipful, but it was worship that challenged listeners, that pushed boundaries, that demanded everything from both the listener and the player. When Winwood heard this, he understood that music could be sacred, that the act of playing could be a form of prayer. The saxophone on this album didn't just produce notes, it made profound statements. The different movements repeated phrases until they became mantras, moved with purpose and power, searched with urgency, and offered prayers spoken aloud through instruments. The entire band played with devotion, and every note mattered deeply. Every moment felt like a ceremony. Winwood absorbed this understanding completely. Music wasn't merely entertainment or commercial product, it was communication with something higher, something that existed beyond words. What truly changed Winwood was observing the total commitment on display, the complete dedication to the music, to the search, to finding truth through sound. That intensity lived in Winwood's own playing throughout his career. When he played organ, he wasn't just playing notes mechanically, he was searching for something real and true. The long improvised jam sessions with Traffic, where the music went to places nobody had planned, were directly influenced by this album. This record taught Steve Winwood that music was a spiritual practice, that improvisation could be a form of meditation, and that when you played from your soul, you touched something eternal. The seventh and final album that Winwood chose was actually his own band's debut from 1967. He selected this not from ego, but from genuine truth. This record captured something he spent his entire career chasing: 4 musicians creating music that came from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Rock, jazz, folk, and psychedelic music all mixed together with no rules, no boundaries, just pure exploration. They recorded the album in a cottage in the English countryside, isolated from everything, just making music because they felt compelled to create. The title track built gradually from nothing into everything. Winwood's organ swirled and climbed, while his voice soared and cracked with genuine emotion. The band jammed without any predetermined destination, following feeling instead of rigid structure. Different songs mixed various styles, and the album wandered purposefully. The point was music as a journey, rather than simply arriving at a destination. What made this album sacred to Winwood was the complete freedom it represented. For the first time in his career, he wasn't following anyone else's rules or commercial formulas. His previous band had focused on hit singles. This was different and risky. This was 4 musicians trusting each other completely with no safety net. Nobody led in a traditional sense. Everyone followed wherever the music wanted to go naturally. This album taught Steve Winwood his most important lesson of all: trust the music itself. Follow the feeling wherever it leads. The best songs aren't simply written according to formulas, but are discovered through exploration. And genuine discovery requires the courage to get lost first, before finding your way to something real and meaningful. Steve Winwood never stopped exploring throughout his long career. These 7 albums taught him about soul,
blues, jazz, courage, and freedom. His organ sang with such expressiveness because these masters taught it a complete musical language. Each album opened doors and showed him new possibilities for what music could express and how deeply it could connect with human emotions and experiences.